Thank you, comrades. I would like to start off by saying the global system of imperialism cannot be destroyed unless oppressed nations politically secede from the oppressor nations and fight to have genuine self-determination. Every oppressed nation that reclaims its resources and democracy from foreign capitalist interests strikes a blow against global imperialism and its parasitic need to underdevelop other nations. In West Africa today, a confederation of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger has formed an anti-imperialist bloc known as the Alliance-of-Sahel-States, officially established on the 6th of July 2024, seeking to reclaim sovereignty over its land from imperialist-backed terrorists and its resources from foreign multinational monopolies. Just go back one slide. I didn't label the names here, but of course, I'm sure many of you recognize who this is. President Ibrahim Traoré. Mr. In the middle, some of you might be able to see like the brown cap. I like they've got different color schemes so you can sort of see it. You've got Abdurrahman Giani of Niger. Let's make some noise for him. And then at the very end, we have Assimi Goïta, who actually started the first of the coups in 2021, President of Mali. Next slide, please. So, historically, these three countries were devastated by French colonialism and used by the French as cheap sources of troops and labor for World War II. Following the costly defeat in Vietnam in 1954, and amid the escalating war in Algeria, which lasted from 54 to 62, France faced growing pressure at home and abroad and feared a total loss of economic and political influence in Africa, as many of its former colonies had promising independence movements. Modibo Keïta, Mali's former Pan-Africanist and socialist independence leader, unified Mali and Senegal with the Mali Federation and later the Ghana-Guinea-Mali Union of African States, and helped industrialize Mali through dozens of state-owned enterprises and created its own national currency between 1960 and 68. But France could not allow this, and it economically constricted Mali, imposing devastating trade restrictions and isolating the nation politically. The imposed economic crisis made the conditions right for a French-backed military coup that would imprison Keïta until he died in May 1977. In Niger, Djibo Bakary founded the Sawaba Party in 1954, a socialist and anti-imperialist force that was crucial in Niger's fight for independence and rejected joining France's then Franco-African community. In response, death squads were deployed in Niger by France under President Charles de Gaulle to crush the Sawaba movement and coerce the Nigerian government into accepting neo-colonial arrangements and delaying independence. In response, the Sawaba Party went underground and launched a guerrilla struggle, backed by Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana, Algeria, and China. The Sawaba movement was also supported by socialist Mali, and Guinea. Next slide, please. In Burkina Faso, national hero and former socialist leader Thomas Sankara, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, took power in 1983, and only in his early 30s, and for 4 years drove forward radical reforms in housing, healthcare, agriculture, and education, championing self-reliance and national sovereignty, rejecting Western aid. Under Sankara, literacy rose from 13% to 73%. 2.5 million children were vaccinated against common diseases, women were appointed to government positions and gained significant rights, and feudal landlords were expropriated, and industrialization took place without foreign aid. On October 15th, 1987, commemorated only a few days ago, Sankara was killed by an armed group with 12 other officials in a coup d'etat, organized by his former colleague Blaise Compaoré, backed again by France. So what are we saying here? French imperialism made sure all of these movements were cut short through brutal methods, ensuring these leaders were killed or politically isolated by colonialist collaborators. For being recognized as independent of France's rule and now independent countries, these three countries are forced to pay enormous reparations and forced to accept long-lasting neo-colonial arrangements with France. The most damaging neo-colonial instrument in France's power is the CFA franc currency, which has been forced on all of its former Western colonies. It enforces a fixed rate of exchange with the euro, a French guarantee of the unlimited convertibility of CFA francs into euros, and the centralization of foreign exchange reserves, forcing Africa's central banks to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in a special French Treasury operating account. In addition to this, it empowers France with voting and veto power in Africa's central banks. This helped usher in a wave of International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank Structural Adjustment Program, or SAPs as they're called, imposed across Africa in the 80s and 90s. Enforcing austerity, public sector cuts, trade liberalization were all enforced. And these changes, they reinforced neo-colonial control through debt, privatization, and externally managed state restructuring. So now we're getting more towards the present. In 2011, as many of you might know, NATO's imperialist intervention in Libya, supported by France, again, that's going to be a common theme, destroyed Gaddafi's Libya, one of the most developed and stable countries in Africa. As a result, Islamic fundamentalists and separatist groups gained easy access to Libya's armory, and weapons flooded across the Sahel. In response, France launched multiple disastrous anti-jihadist operations backed by the US, EU, and Britain, which further destabilized the Sahel. One such incident included France drone striking a wedding, killing 19 civilians, and absolutely disastrous. After another decade of corrupt leaders aligned with French imperialist interests, worsening living conditions, and now deadly terrorist attacks leading to more national territory being occupied, the Sahelian people, as they do, supported multiple military coups in Mali in 2021, Burkina Faso in 2022, and Niger in 2023, removing corrupt leaders and driving out all the foreign troops that were occupying their country. But of course, imperialism was quick to respond, as the Western Aligned Economic Community of West African States, also known as ECOWAS, headed by Nigeria, immediately sanctioned Mali in 2022 and Niger in 2023, threatening to invade Niger militarily. The EU followed suit, sanctioning both Mali and Niger, and they renewed those sanctions as of last year, November, which is disgraceful. However, in response to this, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger signed a mutual defense agreement on the 16th of September 2023, the Lutako-Goma Accords, and have both since left ECOWAS. So that's a history lesson part over. Let's get to the more present things. This is the situation of what is happening in the Sahel states. Three of the poorest countries in the world, now plagued with the most terrorist attacks globally, and consequently millions of internal refugees, all while under sanctions, face the enormous task of building sovereign states to meet the needs of the people. To deal with the jihadist insurgency in Burkina Faso, tens of thousands of Burkinabés heeded a mobilization call and joined their National People's Militia, volunteers for the defense of the fatherland as they're called. Immediately, military support from partners such as Russia, China, and Turkey was sought out on fairer terms that would actually aid their effort, unlike France. Nationalization of mines owned by foreign multinationals, alongside stricter mining laws and the building of refineries, has allowed these nations to receive far more money for their vast mineral resources and effectively finance their war effort. Patriotic support funds have also been established in each nation, used to finance the reconstruction of each respective nation through tax levies and charitable donations, particularly from the diaspora. As a result, the alliance-of-Sahel-states is proving to be a force to be reckoned with in Africa. The success in recapturing land from insurgents and bending mining companies to the will of their respective nations has allowed the AES to massively invest in agriculture to achieve food self-sufficiency, in infrastructure, social welfare, and of course, the military, which is very important. So Burkina Faso right now controls 73% of its territory compared to 40% last summer. Mali reclaimed the city of Kidal, a major trade hub that had been a stronghold for separatist forces for years, especially during the disastrous French military interventions, where French soldiers refused to allow Malian soldiers to in fact recapture the city. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced by these insurgents, are now able to return to their homes, and thousands of schools have reopened due to advances in land recapture. Electrification and energy needs are being advanced in Mali, with an array of solar power plants currently in construction, and in Niger, they plan to use their vast uranium sources to power their country rather than France, which in fact imports 20% of its uranium from Niger. Community projects have been a real driver, such as Faso Mebo in Burkina Faso, which has seen voluntary participation in modernizing the country. Entire communities coming together, building roads together across the entire country. New anti-corruption institutions have recovered millions of dollars from former corrupt politicians and corporations. For the first time in their history, these nations can domestically process their own raw materials, such as Burkina Faso unveiling its first ever tomato processing plant. I mean, it really shows you how massively underdeveloped these countries were. But currently, the AES leadership largely comprises a patriotic, nationalistic, petty bourgeois class led by the military, espousing ideals of Pan-Africanism, anti-imperialism, and self-determination. Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré has a Marxist background and a professed admiration for Thomas Sankara. Burkina Faso citizens have formed a night watch group, the Wayayans, who regularly keep watch across all major checkpoints in their cities in defense of their revolution, which has in fact thwarted multiple coups in the process. In Niger, there is overwhelming support for President Chiani and his government from women's organizations such as the Revolutionary Movement of Pan-African Women of Niger, political parties, and trade unions such as the Marxist Union of Nigerian Scholars. Mali's President Assimi Goïta, also President of the Alliance-of-Sahel-States, continues to push a national, participatory, democratic process that consults all sections of Malian society, formulating concrete recommendations for the current transitional government. These advances and increased sovereignty over a highly valuable mining sector have, of course, necessitated imperialism rearing its ugly head. The mining magnates, Barrick Gold and Orano, continue to raise arbitration cases via the World Bank to halt the expropriation of their mining operations as their control over the mines in those regions wanes. NATO's proxy, Ukraine, continues to provide material support to terrorists in the area under the pretense of freeing Africa from Russia's grip. In a recent interview, Traoré explained it's not really terrorism, it's imperialism, which supports reactionary movements to inhibit development by locking these countries in a devastating ongoing war. In fact, Ibrahim Traoré has survived 7 confirmed assassination and coup attempts, orchestrated by French intelligence and the United States Africa Command, facilitated by French collaborators within Burkina Faso and also through neighbouring country Ivory Coast. In recent addresses to the UN, respective prime ministers of the Alliance-of-Sahel-States condemned France's support for terrorism in the Sahel, and Mali has requested a Security Council meeting to provide irrefutable proof of France's support for terrorist activities. The battle between the Alliance-of-Sahel-State armed forces and foreign-backed terrorists in the region is a brutal, asymmetrical war of attrition, with terrorist forces now focusing more heavily on infrastructure rather than military targets. And what has been the response of the British state and the media? Of course, it continues to shamelessly peddle this narrative that the Alliance-of-Sahel-States is a regressive military dictatorship, going as far as publishing an article about Traoré's visit to Ghana. Traoré right now is probably the most well-known African leader, and the title of that article was "Gun-Wielding Leader Sparks Concern." Really open and shameless about the narrative that they are trying to drive. In fact, Ibrahim Traoré's speeches in particular have resonated around the world with the global black diaspora, calling for a united Africa to reclaim its resources from the imperialists and denouncing African leaders and states who do nothing to fight imperialism. On the 30th of April this year, protests across the world were held in solidarity with Traoré and the Sahel states. On top of its Pan-African character though, the Alliance-of-Sahel-States is also a character, supporting other anti-imperialist nations such as Cuba, Venezuela and Palestine. In March this year, Burkina Faso commemorated 50 years of cooperation with Cuba. Benawende Sankara, not a relative of Sankara, there's quite a few of those, but coordinator of a Burkina-Cuba fraternity collective, stated that it demonstrates the desire of the two countries to continue their collaboration in a spirit of solidarity and mutual benefit, in the service of the development and well-being of their populations. In the health and agriculture sectors, Cuba has made a significant contribution to the development of Burkina Faso. And when Traoré met with Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, Maduro stated, "We are brothers and sisters of the same mother, which is Africa, and today we have started a new path together." At the most recent UN summit, the Alliance-of-Sahel-States leaders condemned the brutal blockade on Cuba and the 1,000 unilateral coercive measures that sanction Venezuela's economy, as well as the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people. But of course, the Alliance-of-Sahel-States will have deep and conflicting contradictions as it struggles for its sovereignty, and that will necessitate internal struggles within those countries in an ongoing back and forth process, which the imperialists will no doubt use as a pretext to legitimize their schemes. However, for us here in Britain, our primary enemy is British imperialism and its collaborators, to whom we must wage an endless battle and pry their malicious hands away from these nations, which are forging their own path and striking a blow against imperialism. Hands off Africa!